We restored a 1966 Mustang for Mom's funeral. Then the priest asked for a ride. When Sarah Miller's mother passes away after a long battle with cancer, she and her estranged brother Jake must come together to fulfill their mother's final wish, to restore her beloved 1966 Ford Mustang convertible and use it as the hearse for her funeral. Set in the small town of Cedar Falls, Ohio, this deeply emotional story follows two siblings as they work against time to rebuild not only a classic car, but also their fractured relationship. What begins as a mechanical challenge becomes a journey of healing, forgiveness, and discovering the true meaning of family legacy. When the local priest makes an unexpected request that tests their newfound bond, the siblings must decide what truly honors their mother's memory. If these stories moved you, imagine what's coming next. Subscribe to Rust and Memory, because some engines don't just start cars, they start memories. Chapter 1. Rust and Remembrance. The autumn rain drummed steadily against the windows of the small funeral home in Cedar Falls, Ohio, creating a melancholy rhythm that seemed to echo the heaviness in Sarah Miller's chest. She sat in the uncomfortable leather chair across from Mr. Henderson, the funeral director, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she tried to focus on his words about casket selections and flower arrangements. But her mind kept drifting to the phone call she'd received that morning from her brother Jake, the first time they'd spoken in 3 years. "I'm sorry, could you repeat that?" Sarah asked, pushing a strand of her auburn hair behind her ear. At 34, she had inherited her mother's delicate features, but carried the weight of responsibility in the slight lines around her green eyes. Mr. Henderson, a patient man in his 60s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, leaned forward slightly. "I was asking about transportation arrangements for Mrs. Miller. Do you have a preference for the hearse?" Sarah's breath caught. She remembered her mother's words from just 2 weeks ago, when the cancer had taken most of her strength, but not her spirit. "Promise me something, sweetheart," Eleanor Miller had whispered from her hospital bed, her frail hand gripping Sarah's with surprising intensity. "Don't let them put me in one of those cold, impersonal hearses. I want to go in the Mustang, my red Mustang." "Mom, that car hasn't run in 15 years, Sarah had protested gently. "It's been sitting in the garage, and it's not exactly in funeral condition." Eleanor had smiled then, that mischievous smile that had charmed everyone from the local grocery store clerks to the doctors treating her. "Then you'll fix it, you and Jake, together." Now, sitting in the funeral home, Sarah felt the weight of that promise pressing down on her shoulders like a physical burden. She looked up at Mr. Henderson, who was waiting patiently for her response. "Actually," she began, her voice stronger than she felt, "my mother had a specific request. She wanted to be transported in her 1966 Ford Mustang convertible." Mr. Henderson's eyebrows rose slightly. "That's quite unusual, Miss Miller. Is the vehicle in working condition?" Sarah's laugh was hollow. "Not exactly, but it will be." An hour later, Sarah stood in the driveway of her childhood home on Maple Street, staring at the detached garage that had been closed for years. The 2-story colonial house, with its white siding and green shutters, looked smaller than she remembered, somehow diminished by the grey October sky and the absence of her mother's presence. The front porch still held the wooden swing where Eleanor used to sit with her morning coffee, but now it swayed empty in the autumn breeze. She pulled out her phone and dialed Jake's number, her finger hesitating over the call button. The last time they'd spoken, it had been a screaming match about their mother's care, about responsibility, about all the ways they'd disappointed each other over the years. Jake had stormed out, saying he couldn't watch their mother slowly die, and Sarah had let him go, too proud and too hurt to call him back. The phone rang 3 times before his familiar voice answered, deeper now, but still carrying that hint of recklessness that had gotten him into trouble throughout their childhood. "Sarah? I'm at the house," she said without preamble. "I need help with the Mustang." There was a long pause, filled with the sound of rain and distant traffic. "You're serious about this?" "She asked for it, Jake. It was her dying wish." Another pause, then a heavy sigh. "I'll be there in an hour." Sarah hung up and approached the garage, fishing the key from under the ceramic frog their mother had always used as a hiding spot, a habit that had driven their father crazy before his death 8 years ago. The lock was stiff with age and moisture, but it finally gave way with a rusty screech. The garage door rolled up with a groan of protest, and Sarah stepped into the musty darkness, breathing in the familiar scent of motor oil, sawdust, and time. She found the light switch, and the single bulb illuminated a scene that made her heart sink. There, covered by a paint-stained tarp, sat the 1966 Ford Mustang convertible that had been her mother's pride and joy. Eleanor had bought it used in 1975 with money she'd saved from her job as a secretary at the local bank, back when women weren't supposed to buy their own cars, and certainly weren't supposed to buy sporty red convertibles. "It's my freedom machine," she used to say, taking Sarah and Jake for drives through the Ohio countryside with the top down and the radio playing rock and roll from the 60s. But that had been a lifetime ago. Now, as Sarah pulled away the tarp, she revealed a car that looked more like a monument to neglect than a symbol of freedom. The once vibrant red paint was faded and spotted with rust. The soft top was torn in several places, and the chrome bumpers were pitted with corrosion. She opened the hood and winced at the sight of the engine, if it could still be called that. Years of Ohio winters and summers had taken their toll, leaving behind a maze of corroded parts, cracked hoses, and what appeared to be a small ecosystem growing in the corners. "Jesus Christ!" came Jake's voice from behind her. Sarah turned to see her brother standing in the garage entrance, water dripping from his leather jacket onto the concrete floor. At 31, Jake had grown into their father's tall frame, but his dark hair was longer now, touching his collar, and there were new lines around his brown eyes that spoke of hard years and harder choices. He looked like he'd driven straight through from wherever he'd been living. Chicago, she thought, or maybe Milwaukee. She'd lost track during their years of silence. "It's worse than I remembered," Sarah admitted, stepping back from the car. Jake walked around the Mustang slowly, his mechanic's eye taking in every detail of decay. Despite their differences, Sarah had to admit that if anyone could resurrect this car, it was Jake. He'd been working on engines since he was 12, had a natural gift that their father had nurtured before his own death. It was one of the few things Jake had never given up on, even when he'd given up on everything else. "The good news," Jake said finally, running his hand along the doorframe, "is that the body's solid under all this surface rust. The frame looks straight." He popped the hood and leaned in, his experienced hands checking connections and components. "The bad news is that this engine is basically a boat anchor at this point. We'd need to rebuild it from the ground up." Sarah felt her heart sink. How long would that take? Done right? Months? Maybe a year? Jake straightened up and looked at her, his expression softening slightly. "When's the funeral?" "Saturday. 4 days." Jake was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah could see him thinking, calculating, weighing possibilities against impossibilities. It was an expression she remembered from their childhood, when Jake would spend hours in this same garage with their father, the two of them hunched over engine blocks and transmission cases, speaking in a language of carburetors and compression ratios that Sarah had never quite understood. "We can't rebuild the engine," Jake said finally, "but we might be able to swap it. I know a guy who deals in classic Mustang parts. If we can find a running 2K9, and if the stars align, and if we work around the clock." He trailed off, shaking his head. "It's crazy, Sarah. Even if we manage to get it running, the interior's shot, the paint's gone to hell, and God knows what else we'll find once we start tearing into it." "But you think it's possible?" Jake looked at the car again, then at his sister. For a moment, the years of anger and resentment seemed to fall away, and Sarah saw the little boy who used to help their mother wash this same car in the driveway every Saturday morning, both of them soaked and laughing by the time they were done. "Mom really wanted this?" he asked quietly. Sarah nodded. "She said she wanted to go out in style. Said she'd had enough of practical choices for one lifetime." Jake smiled for the first time since he'd arrived, a real smile that reminded Sarah of better days. "That sounds like her." He walked to the workbench that lined the back wall of the garage, brushing dust off the tools that had sat unused for years. "Okay, let's bring her back to life." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity as the siblings began the massive task of assessment and planning. Jake called his contact about engines, while Sarah started documenting everything that needed to be done, creating lists that seemed to grow longer by the minute. They pulled the seats out to get a better look at the interior, removed the damaged soft top, and began the delicate process of draining fluids that had turned to sludge over the years. As they worked, they talked, tentatively at first, then with growing ease. Jake told her about his job at a restoration shop in Chicago, how he'd been saving money to open his own place. Sarah shared stories about her work as a high school English teacher, about the students who reminded her of Jake at that age, full of potential but lost in their own anger. "I'm sorry I wasn't here," Jake said suddenly, as they struggled to remove a particularly stubborn bolt from the transmission. "When she got sick, I mean. I should have been here." Sarah paused in her work, looking at her brother across the engine bay. The afternoon light filtering through the garage windows highlighted the exhaustion in his face, the weight of guilt he'd been carrying. She understood, Jake. She knew you couldn't handle watching her go through that. She wasn't angry. "But you were." Sarah set down her wrench and leaned against the car. "Yeah, I was, but not just at you. I was angry at everything, at the cancer, at Dad for not being here to help her through it, at myself for not being enough to make her better. You were just available to be angry at." Jake nodded, not looking up from his work. "I kept meaning to call. Every day I'd pick up the phone and then put it down. I didn't know what to say. You could have said hello." "Yeah, I should have." They worked in comfortable silence for a while, the familiar rhythm of shared labor beginning to rebuild something between them that had been broken for too long. As the sun began to set, painting the garage in warm golden light, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years: hope, not just for the car, but for the possibility that they might actually be able to do this together. Jake's phone rang just as they were cleaning up for the evening. He answered it with hands still black with motor oil, and Sarah could hear the excitement in his voice as he talked to whoever was on the other end. "That was Tommy," Jake said when he hung up. "He's got a 289 V8 that was rebuilt 6 months ago. The guy who bought it changed his mind about the project, and Tommy's been sitting on it ever since." "Is it compatible?" "Should be. It's the right year, right specs. Tommy's going to drive it down from Cleveland tonight. We can have it here first thing in the morning." Sarah felt a surge of excitement mixed with terror. "This is really happening, isn't it?" Jake grinned, and for a moment he looked like the teenager she remembered, the one who used to spend every weekend in this garage with their father, learning the mysteries of internal combustion and dreaming of the day he'd have his own shop. "Yeah, it's really happening. We're going to give Mom the send-off she deserves." As they locked up the garage and prepared to head inside for dinner, Sarah caught Jake looking back at the covered car one more time. There was something in his expression that she couldn't quite read. Determination, maybe, or the weight of a promise being made. "Jake?" "Yeah? Thank you for coming back, for doing this." He was quiet for a moment, then reached out and squeezed her shoulder. "She was our mom, Sarah. Whatever else happened between us, that never changed." Inside the house, they ordered pizza and sat at the kitchen table where they'd eaten thousands of meals as children. The silence between them was different now, not the angry silence of their estrangement, but the comfortable quiet of people who were beginning to remember why they'd once been close. 4 days, Sarah said, looking at the calendar on the refrigerator where their mother had marked doctor's appointments and book club meetings right up until the end. 4 days, Jake agreed. We can do this. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the first stars were appearing in the clearing sky. Somewhere in Cleveland, a truck was heading south with a rebuilt engine that might just be the key to keeping a promise to a woman who had taught them that sometimes the impossible was just another word for what you hadn't tried hard enough to achieve. In the garage, under its paint-stained tarp, the 1966 Ford Mustang waited patiently for resurrection, holding within its rusted frame the memories of summer drives and family laughter, and the hope of one final journey. Chapter 2. Under Pressure. The mechanical alarm clock that had belonged to their father rang at 5:30 a.m., its harsh bell cutting through the pre-dawn silence of the house on Maple Street. Sarah had barely slept, her mind cycling through everything that could go wrong with their impossible project. Every time she'd closed her eyes, she'd seen her mother's face in the hospital, heard her voice asking for that one last ride in her beloved Mustang. She found Jake already in the kitchen, nursing a cup of black coffee and staring at a notepad covered with sketches and calculations. He looked like he hadn't slept at all. His hair was disheveled, and there were dark circles under his eyes. But there was also an energy about him that she hadn't seen in years. "Tommy's 40 minutes out," he said, without looking up. "I've been thinking about the timeline. If we can get the engine mounted by noon, we might have a shot at getting her running by tomorrow night." Sarah poured herself coffee and sat across from him, studying the diagrams he'd drawn. Even though she'd never been mechanically inclined like Jake, she could see the complexity of what they were attempting. "What about the interior? The paint?" "One crisis at a time," Jake said, finally meeting her eyes. "Let's get her breathing first." The sound of a diesel truck rumbling into the driveway interrupted their conversation. Through the kitchen window, Sarah could see a weathered Ford pickup with a small trailer behind it, both covered in road salt and bearing Ohio plates. A thin man in his 50s climbed out of the cab, stretching his back and looking around at the quiet suburban street. "That's Tommy," Jake said, already heading for the door. Tommy Kowalski looked exactly like what Sarah had imagined a parts dealer would look like: work boots, faded jeans, and a flannel shirt that had seen better decades. His weathered hands spoke of a lifetime spent working with tools, and his sharp blue eyes missed nothing as he surveyed the house and garage. "Jake, you crazy son of a bitch," Tommy said with a grin, extending a hand blackened with permanent motor oil stains. "When you called last night, I thought you were drunk." "Not drunk, just desperate," Jake replied, leading them toward the garage. "Tommy, this is my sister Sarah. Sarah, Tommy's the guy who keeps every gearhead in the Midwest running." Tommy tipped an imaginary hat. "Ma'am? Sorry for your loss. Jake told me what you're trying to do here." He shook his head with what might have been admiration or concern. 4 days to resurrect a car that's been dead for 15 years. That's either the most romantic thing I've ever heard or the stupidest. "Probably both," Sarah admitted. They rolled up the garage door, and Tommy walked slowly around the covered Mustang, his experienced eye taking in details that weren't visible to the siblings. When Jake pulled away the tarp, Tommy whistled low. "Well, she's not pretty, but the bones are good," he said, running his hand along the doorframe where rust spots bloomed like flowers. "66 convertible, 289 V8. These are getting rare." He popped the hood and leaned in to examine the dead engine. "Yeah, this motor's done. Seized solid, but the engine bay's clean, no major damage to the mounts." Tommy walked back to his trailer and began untying the straps that held his cargo in place. When he pulled back the tarp, Sarah gasped. Sitting on a custom engine stand was what looked like a work of art. A gleaming V8 engine with chrome valve covers and fresh black paint, every bolt and wire showing the care of a master craftsman. "Rebuilt 289 with a mild cam upgrade," Tommy said with obvious pride. Board, borrow 30 over, new pistons, the works, should make about 250 horsepower, which is more than the original ever dreamed of. He looked at Jake seriously. This is a $5,000 engine, son. I'm letting you have it for 3 because of the circumstances, but I need payment up front. Sarah felt her stomach drop. Her teacher's salary barely covered her monthly expenses, and her savings account had been decimated by her mother's medical bills that insurance hadn't covered. She started to speak, but Jake held up a hand. "I've got it," he said quietly, pulling out a worn leather wallet. Sarah watched in surprise as he counted out $100 bills, money that represented months of saving for his dream of opening his own shop. "Jake, I can't let you—" "Mum left me money too, Sarah. In her way." He handed the cash to Tommy. "She always said family comes first. Always." The next several hours passed in a whirlwind of carefully orchestrated chaos. Tommy proved invaluable, not just for his engine, but for his encyclopedic knowledge of classic Mustangs. While Jake and Sarah struggled to remove the old engine using a borrowed cherry picker from the neighbor, Tommy diagnosed a dozen other problems that would need addressing. "Your brake system's shot," he announced, after crawling under the car. "Lines are corroded, master cylinders leaking. You're not driving this thing anywhere without new brakes." "How long?" Jake asked, sweat dripping from his forehead as he wrestled with a stubborn transmission bolt. "If we can get parts today, I can have them rebuilt by tomorrow morning. I know a guy." Sarah was learning that Tommy knew a lot of guys. By lunchtime, he'd made 4 phone calls and arranged for brake parts, a new soft top, seat covers, and a mobile detailing service that specialized in emergency cosmetic work. Each call represented money they didn't have and time they couldn't afford, but somehow Tommy made it all seem possible. The old engine came out harder than it should have. Years of corrosion had fused bolts that should have turned easily, and they broke 3 sockets before Jake admitted they needed help. Tommy disappeared for an hour and returned with an acetylene torch and a selection of cutting tools that looked like they belonged in a surgical suite. "Sometimes you need to destroy something to save it," he said, lighting the torch with practiced ease. By 3 o'clock, the old engine sat on the garage floor like a defeated giant, its rusted bulk a stark contrast to the gleaming replacement that waited on Tommy's stand. Sarah had never realized how small an engine bay looked without an engine in it. The Mustang seemed wounded, vulnerable, its mechanical heart laid bare. Jake and Tommy worked with the synchronized precision of experienced mechanics, but Sarah could see the tension in her brother's shoulders, the way his jaw clenched when something didn't go as planned. The weight of their impossible deadline was pressing down on all of them. "Sarah, we need to talk about the funeral arrangements," Jake said during a brief break, his hands black with grease and his shirt soaked with sweat. "If we're going to use the car, we need to coordinate with the funeral home, the church, the cemetery. There are logistics." "I'll handle that," Sarah said quickly. She'd been dreading this conversation with Father Martinez, their family priest, who had known Eleanor Miller for 30 years. How do you explain to a man of God that you want to use a hastily restored muscle car as a hearse? She left the men working and drove across town to St. Mary's Catholic Church, a modest brick building that had served the Latino and Polish communities of Cedar Falls for over a century. Father Martinez was in his office, a small room cluttered with theological texts and community outreach flyers. At 62, he was still the energetic man who had baptized both Sarah and Jake, but his black hair was now silver, and his kind face bore the lines of someone who had comforted many families through their darkest hours. "Sarah, my dear child," he said, rising to embrace her, "I'm so sorry about your mother. She was a remarkable woman." "Thank you, Father. She thought very highly of you, too." Sarah sat in the familiar chair across from his desk, the same chair where she'd discussed her confirmation 20 years ago. "I need to talk to you about the funeral arrangements. Mom had a specific request that's unusual." Father Martinez leaned back in his chair, his expression patient and attentive. "Tell me." Sarah explained about the Mustang, about her mother's final wish, about the frantic restoration currently taking place in the garage. She watched the priest's face carefully, expecting disapproval or concern about the appropriateness of using a sports car in a sacred ceremony. Instead, Father Martinez smiled. "Do you know what your mother told me the last time I visited her in the hospital?" he asked. "She said, 'Father, I've spent my whole life being appropriate. I think it's time to be authentic instead.'" He chuckled softly. "She was worried that you and Jake would think it was too unconventional, too much trouble. I told her that love is never too much trouble." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "So you'll allow it?" "My dear, I've presided over funerals where the deceased was honored with fire trucks, motorcycles, and once, memorably, a restored World War II bomber that flew overhead during the service. If Eleanor Miller wants to make her final journey in the car that brought her joy, then that's exactly what should happen." Relief flooded through Sarah, followed immediately by a new wave of anxiety. "There's just one problem, Father. Jake and we haven't been to church in years. I'm not sure we remember the protocols, the proper procedures." "The proper procedure," Father Martinez said gently, "is to honor your mother's memory with love and dignity. Everything else we can figure out together." He paused, studying Sarah's face. "But there's something else troubling you, isn't there?" Sarah hesitated, then decided on honesty. "I'm terrified we won't finish in time, that we'll let her down, that this whole thing is just a fantasy, and Saturday morning we'll be calling the funeral home to arrange for a regular hearse because we couldn't make it work." Father Martinez was quiet for a moment, then reached across his desk to take Sarah's hands in his. "Faith, my child, is not the belief that God will do what you want. Faith is the trust that God will help you do what needs to be done. Your mother had faith in you and Jake. Now you need to have faith in yourselves." Sarah drove back to the house feeling lighter but no less pressured. The afternoon sun was slanting low through the trees, casting long shadows across Maple Street, and she could hear the sound of power tools coming from the garage. When she pulled into the driveway, she found Jake and Tommy hunched over the Mustang's engine bay, the new V8 suspended from the cherry picker as they maneuvered it into position. "How'd it go with the priest?" Jake called out without looking up from his work. "He's on board. Says Mom told him this was what she wanted." Sarah watched as the two men guided the engine with millimeter precision, their movements careful and deliberate. "How's it going here?" "Getting there," Tommy grunted, adjusting the angle of the hoist. "This is the tricky part. Everything has to line up perfectly, or we'll be starting over." Sarah held her breath as they lowered the engine slowly into the bay. She found herself whispering a prayer she hadn't said since childhood, asking for help, for precision, for just enough luck to make this impossible thing work. The engine settled into place with a soft thunk that seemed to echo through the garage. Jake and Tommy exchanged a look of satisfaction, then immediately began the complex process of bolting everything into position. Motor mounts, transmission coupling, exhaust manifolds. Each connection was critical, and there was no room for error. As the sun set behind the trees of Cedar Falls, casting the garage in warm amber light, Sarah watched her brother work with a concentration and skill that reminded her of their father. Jake's hands moved with confidence over the engine, connecting hoses and wires with the instinctive knowledge of someone who understood the mechanical poetry of internal combustion. "Tomorrow we'll know if she runs," Jake said as they finally called it a day. The engine was mounted, most of the major connections were complete, but dozens of smaller details remained. Tommy gathered his tools and prepared to head to a local motel for the night. "I'll be back at dawn with the brake parts," he said. "And I called my detailing guy, Miguel. He'll be here tomorrow afternoon to work on the cosmetics." After Tommy left, Sarah and Jake sat on the front porch swing, both too exhausted to move, but too wired to sleep. The October air was crisp and clear, carrying the scent of burning leaves from somewhere in the neighborhood. "You know what I keep thinking about?" Sarah said, pushing the swing gently with her foot. "What?" "That summer when Dad taught you to rebuild the lawnmower engine. You were maybe 14, and you spent 3 weeks on it, taking it apart and putting it back together until you understood every piece." She smiled at the memory. "Mom was so frustrated because the grass kept growing, but Dad just kept saying he's learning something important." Jake nodded. "I remember. And when I finally got it running again, Dad made such a big deal about it. Like I'd invented the internal combustion engine instead of just fixing a old Briggs & Stratton. He was proud of you." They both were. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars appear in the darkening sky. 3 days remained until the funeral, and the Mustang was still more potential than reality. But for the first time since this crazy project began, Sarah felt like they might actually pull it off. "Jake?" "Yeah? Whatever happens, I'm glad you came back. I missed you." Jake reached over and squeezed her hand. "I missed you too, sis. And I'm sorry it took Mom dying to bring me home. She'd say it doesn't matter why, just that you're here." "Yeah, that sounds like her." Jake stood up and stretched, his back protesting after hours of leaning over an engine. "Come on, tomorrow's going to be a long day, and we need some sleep." As they headed inside, Sarah took one last look at the garage where their mother's car waited patiently for resurrection. 3 days to finish what they'd started. 3 days to keep a promise to a woman who had taught them that love was more important than logic, and that sometimes the most important journeys were the ones that seemed impossible from the beginning. In the distance, a train whistle echoed across the sleeping town of Cedar Falls, carrying freight and dreams toward destinations unknown. In the morning, they would find out if their own journey would reach its intended destination, or if some promises were too big for human hands to keep. Chapter 3. Race Against Time. The sound that woke Sarah at 5:15 a.m. wasn't her alarm clock. It was the unmistakable rumble of a diesel engine in the driveway, followed by the hydraulic whine of air brakes. She stumbled to the window and saw Tommy's truck again. But this time he wasn't alone. A second truck had pulled up behind him, this one newer and painted white with Hernandez Auto Detailing written in flowing script across the doors. By the time Sarah had thrown on clothes and made it to the garage, Jake was already there with 2 cups of coffee, looking more rested than he had since arriving. The past 2 days of intense work seemed to have energized him in a way she hadn't seen since their teenage years. "Miguel's early," Jake said, nodding toward the white truck where a compact man in his 30s was unloading equipment with practiced efficiency. "Tommy says he's the best mobile detailer in 3 counties. Miguel Hernandez turned out to be a soft-spoken perfectionist with calloused hands and an artist's eye for detail. He walked around the Mustang slowly, taking photographs from every angle, his expression serious and thoughtful. "She's hurt bad," he said finally, his slight accent adding weight to the words. "But I've seen worse. The paint, it can be saved with compound and polish. The chrome will take more work, but it's possible." He ran his finger along a particularly bad rust spot on the rear quarter panel. "This will need body work, but I can make it look good from 10 feet away. Close up." He shrugged. "Your mama, she won't be looking that close, I think." Tommy had arrived with a cardboard box full of brake components and a thermos of coffee so strong it could have powered the Mustang by itself. Within minutes, he and Jake were under the car, their voices echoing off the concrete floor as they discussed brake line routing and proportioning valves. Sarah found herself relegated to support crew, running for tools and parts, holding lights, and trying to stay out of the way of the controlled chaos that had taken over the garage. But she didn't mind. Watching the 3 men work was like witnessing a perfectly choreographed dance, each knowing instinctively what the others needed. "Sarah, we need to test the electrical system," Jake called out from under the dashboard. "Can you turn the key to the accessory position?" Sarah slid into the driver's seat, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the steering wheel that her mother had held thousands of times. The interior was in worse shape than she'd realized. The seat covers were cracked and faded, the dashboard was warped from years of sun exposure, and the carpet was more rust-colored than its original black. But there was something else, something she hadn't noticed before. Hanging from the rearview mirror was a small silver cross, tarnished with age but still recognizable. Sarah remembered her mother putting it there the day she'd bought the car, a blessing for safe travels. Somehow it had survived 15 years of neglect, waiting patiently for one last journey. "Turn it," Jake called again. Sarah turned the key, and the dashboard came alive with lights. The fuel gauge showed empty, the oil pressure was 0, but the electrical system was working. It was a small victory, but in their situation, small victories felt enormous. "Good," Jake said, emerging from under the dash with cobwebs in his hair. "Now let's see if she'll fire up." The moment of truth had arrived sooner than Sarah expected. Tommy finished connecting the last brake line and gave Jake a thumbs up. Miguel had moved on to working on the interior, using tools that looked more like surgical instruments than car care equipment. Jake wiped his hands on a rag and looked at Sarah. "You want to do the honors?" Sarah's heart pounded as she turned the key to the start position. The starter motor cranked, turning the fresh engine over with mechanical precision. Once, twice, 3 times, but no ignition. Jake opened the hood and made some adjustments, checking connections and fluid levels. "Try again." This time, on the second revolution, the engine caught with a roar that filled the garage and seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. The sound was powerful, throaty, and utterly different from the sedate purr of modern cars. This was the sound of American muscle, of an era when engines were built to make noise, and horsepower was more important than fuel economy. Sarah laughed with delight and relief, tears streaming down her face as the engine settled into a steady idle. Through the windshield, she could see Jake grinning like a teenager, his face lit up with the pure joy of mechanical success. "She's alive!" Tommy shouted over the engine noise, then made a motion for Sarah to shut it down. "But we've got work to do before she's ready for the road." The rest of the morning passed in a blur of final adjustments and preparations. The brake system needed bleeding, the carburetor required tuning, and a dozen small leaks and loose connections demanded attention. Miguel worked his magic on the interior, somehow making 30-year-old vinyl look almost new, with a combination of cleaners, conditioners, and what appeared to be pure artistry. At noon, Father Martinez arrived unexpectedly, pulling up in his modest Honda Civic and stepping out with the careful movements of a man who spent most of his time behind a desk. Sarah hurried to greet him, suddenly self-conscious about the chaos in the garage. "Father, I wasn't expecting—" "I hope you don't mind the intrusion," he said with a gentle smile. "I wanted to see how the restoration was progressing. And I have to admit, I was curious about the famous Mustang that Eleanor talked about so often." Sarah led him to the garage, where the priest stopped in the doorway and stared at the car in obvious amazement. Miguel had worked miracles. The paint, while not perfect, gleamed with a deep red luster that seemed to glow in the afternoon light. The chrome had been polished to a mirror finish, and the interior looked like it belonged in a classic car show rather than a funeral procession. "My word," Father Martinez whispered. "It's beautiful." Jake emerged from under the hood, his face streaked with grease, but wearing a smile of satisfaction. "Father, good to see you. What do you think?" Father Martinez walked slowly around the car, taking in every detail with the appreciation of someone who understood the love and labor that had gone into its resurrection. "I think your mother would be very pleased," he said finally. "But I have to ask, is it actually roadworthy?" "Should be," Tommy said, wiping his hands on a shop rag. "We've got one more day to sort out the details, but mechanically she's sound." Jake did good work. The priest nodded, then turned to Sarah with an expression that seemed almost embarrassed. "I have a confession to make. I've been thinking about Saturday's service, about the procession to the cemetery, and, well, I have an unusual request." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. Had Father Martinez changed his mind about allowing the Mustang in the funeral? "What is it, Father? Would there be room for a passenger?" he asked quietly. "I mean, besides Eleanor, of course. I've been Eleanor's priest for 30 years, and I've always ridden in the lead car to the cemetery. But with the Mustang—" He trailed off, looking almost sheepish. Jake grinned. "Father, are you asking for a ride in a '66 Mustang convertible?" Father Martinez's cheeks reddened slightly. "I suppose I am. I've never ridden in a classic muscle car, and it seems like Eleanor would approve of sharing her final ride with an old friend." Sarah felt a wave of emotion wash over her. The image of their dignified family priest riding in the passenger seat of her mother's restored Mustang was so perfectly in keeping with Eleanor Miller's spirit that she almost laughed out loud. "Of course, Father," she said. "Mom would love that." After the priest left, promising to return Saturday morning in casual clothes, I have a feeling vestments and convertibles don't mix well. The work took on a new urgency. There were still dozens of details to address. The soft top needed adjustment, the radio needed to be connected, and someone had to figure out how to secure a casket in the back seat. That last problem had been weighing on Sarah's mind all day. She'd seen funeral processions before, of course, but never one involving a sports car. How exactly did one transport a casket in a vehicle that had been designed for weekend drives and dates to the drive-in? Tommy solved the problem with typical ingenuity. "We build a platform," he said, sketching on his ever-present notepad. "Something that mounts to the floor brackets and extends across both seats. Covered in black fabric, it'll look dignified and hold the weight safely." "Can we do that by tomorrow?" Jake asked. "We can do anything by tomorrow," Tommy replied, with the confidence of a man who had made a career out of impossible deadlines. "I know a guy." Of course he did. Miguel finished his work as the sun began to set, stepping back to admire his handiwork with obvious pride. The transformation was stunning. The Mustang looked like it had just rolled off the showroom floor in 1966. All gleaming chrome and deep red paint that seemed to glow with internal fire. "Your mama, she's gonna ride in style," Miguel said, packing his equipment with the same careful precision he'd shown in his work. "This car, it has good spirit. I can feel it." After Miguel left, Sarah, Jake, and Tommy stood in the garage, looking at their creation in the fading light. It was hard to believe that just 3 days ago, the car had been a rusted hulk covered by a paint-stained tarp. Now it looked ready for a car show or a funeral or whatever other adventures might come its way. "We should take her for a test drive," Jake said. "Make sure everything's working properly." "Is that wise?" Sarah asked. "What if something breaks? What if something's wrong and we don't find out until Saturday morning?" Jake countered. "Better to know now." Tommy nodded in agreement. "He's right. Better to shake out any problems while we can still fix them." Sarah found herself behind the wheel again, this time with Jake in the passenger seat and Tommy squeezed into the back. The engine fired immediately, settling into the same throaty idle they'd heard that morning. Jake reached over and switched on the radio, and somehow, impossibly, it worked, filling the car with the sound of classic rock from the local oldies station. Sarah put the car in reverse and backed slowly out of the garage, her heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and terror. The Mustang felt different from any car she'd ever driven. More alive somehow, more connected to the road and the driver. The steering was heavier than modern cars. The clutch required more effort, but there was something deeply satisfying about the mechanical precision of it all. They drove slowly through the quiet streets of Cedar Falls, past the high school where Sarah taught, past the diner where their family used to go for Sunday breakfast, past all the landmarks of their childhood. The Mustang drew stares and waves from pedestrians, and Sarah found herself smiling and waving back, caught up in the infectious joy that seemed to radiate from the car itself. "How does she feel?" Jake asked, as they pulled into the parking lot of an abandoned shopping center to turn around. "Like Mom," Sarah said without thinking, then felt tears prick her eyes as she realized the truth of it. "She feels like Mom. Strong and graceful and just a little bit rebellious." They drove back to the house as full darkness settled over the town, the Mustang's headlights cutting through the October evening like beacons. Sarah parked in the driveway rather than the garage, unable to bear the thought of hiding the beautiful car away again. "Tomorrow we install the platform and do final adjustments," Jake said as they walked toward the house. "Then Saturday morning we keep our promise," Sarah finished. That evening they ordered Chinese takeout and ate it at the kitchen table, too exhausted for conversation, but too keyed up to sleep. The house felt different somehow, less empty, less haunted by loss. The successful restoration of the Mustang had brought something back to life besides just an old car. "I've been thinking," Jake said as they finished their meal. "About after the funeral, I mean. About what happens next." Sarah looked up from her low mane, suddenly anxious. "You're leaving again." "I have to. My job, my apartment, they're in Chicago, but maybe I don't have to stay away so long this time. Maybe I could come back more often." "I'd like that," Sarah said quietly. "I think Mom would like that too." Jake nodded, then looked out the window toward the driveway where the Mustang sat under the streetlights, its red paint gleaming like a jewel. "You know what she'd really like? She'd like us to keep it running, not let it sit in the garage for another 15 years. Sarah followed his gaze to the car that had somehow brought them back together. "Are you suggesting we share custody of a 1966 Mustang?" "Why not? I could come down for long weekends. We could take it to car shows, maybe drive it to the lake like we used to do with Mom and Dad." Jake's voice carried a note of hope that Sarah hadn't heard in years. "It seems like a shame to let all this work go to waste." Sarah smiled, imagining summer drives with the top down, imagining the sound of her mother's laughter carried on the wind. "I think that's exactly what she'd want." Outside, Cedar Falls settled into the quiet rhythm of a small-town evening. Dogs barked in distant yards, televisions flickered behind curtained windows, and somewhere a train whistle echoed across the darkness. In the driveway, the restored Mustang waited for its most important journey, carrying within its gleaming curves the love of a family, the skill of craftsmen, and the hope that some promises are worth any sacrifice to keep. One more day remained until Eleanor Miller's funeral, and her beloved car was ready to carry her home. Chapter 4. The Final Journey. Friday night passed in restless sleep and anxious dreams. Sarah woke several times to check the weather forecast on her phone, praying that the crisp October day would hold. A funeral procession in a convertible required cooperation from Mother Nature, and the last thing they needed was rain on Eleanor Miller's final ride. At 5:30 a.m., she gave up on sleep entirely and padded to the kitchen to start coffee. Through the window, she could see the Mustang sitting in the driveway like a sleeping guardian, its red paint catching the first hints of dawn. In just a few hours, it would carry her mother on the most important journey of their restoration project. Jake was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with his phone, scrolling through weather reports and traffic conditions. He looked up when Sarah entered, his hair disheveled but his eyes alert. "Clear skies, light winds, high of 68 degrees, he reported. "Perfect convertible weather." How are you feeling?" Sarah asked, pouring herself coffee and noting the slight tremor in her hands. "Terrified," Jake admitted with a rueful smile. "What if something goes wrong? What if the engine stalls in the middle of Main Street? What if we've missed something important?" Sarah sat across from him, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. "Then we deal with it, together. That's what Mom would want." At 7 o'clock, Tommy arrived with the promised platform, a beautifully crafted piece of furniture that looked more like something from a high-end yacht than a car accessory. It was made of polished hardwood with brass fittings and covered in deep black velvet that would provide a dignified resting place for Eleanor's casket. "This is gorgeous work," Sarah said, running her hand along the smooth wood. Tommy shrugged, but she could see the pride in his eyes. "Your mum deserves the best. Besides, I had to call in some favors to get it done overnight. My buddy Rico runs a custom woodworking shop, and he pulled an all-nighter to finish it. Installing the platform required precision and patience. It had to be perfectly level, absolutely secure, and positioned so that it wouldn't interfere with the car's safety systems." Tommy and Jake worked together with the practiced efficiency of men who understood that there was no room for error. At 8:30, Father Martinez arrived as promised, wearing khakis and a navy polo shirt that made him look like he was heading to a golf game rather than a funeral. He carried a small leather satchel containing the items he would need for the graveside service. "I have to admit," he said, looking at the transformed Mustang, "I'm nervous. I've never officiated a funeral quite like this one." "None of us have," Sarah replied. "But Mom always said that the best adventures are the ones that scare you a little." The funeral home had requested that they arrive by 9:15 to coordinate the final details. Sarah felt her anxiety spike as they prepared to drive the Mustang across town, where it would be loaded with Eleanor's casket and take its place at the head of a funeral procession. Jake started the engine, and the familiar rumble filled the morning air with mechanical music. Everything sounded perfect. The timing was spot on, the idle was smooth, and there were no unusual noises or vibrations. Tommy's rebuilt engine was performing flawlessly. "She's ready," Jake announced, sliding out from behind the wheel so Sarah could take her place as the designated driver. The drive to Henderson Funeral Home was surreal, a test run for the most important journey the Mustang would ever make. Sarah drove carefully, hyper-aware of every sound and sensation, but the car handled beautifully. The steering was precise, the brakes were firm, and the transmission shifted smoothly through all 4 gears. Mr. Henderson was waiting for them in the parking lot, wearing his customary black suit and an expression of professional concern. Sarah could see him mentally cataloguing every detail of the vintage convertible, no doubt wondering if he was about to witness either a beautiful tribute or an embarrassing disaster. "Miss Miller," he said formally, "the vehicle looks impressive. Are you confident it will perform reliably during the procession?" "Absolutely," Jake said with more certainty than Sarah felt. "We've tested every system multiple times." The funeral home staff had clearly prepared for this unusual arrangement. They worked with surprising efficiency to transfer Eleanor's casket from their preparation room to the Mustang, securing it to Tommy's custom platform with specially designed straps that were hidden beneath the black velvet covering. Sarah watched the process with a strange mixture of grief and pride. Her mother had always been unconventional, the kind of woman who wore red lipstick to PTA meetings and refused to let anyone tell her what was appropriate for a widow. Seeing Eleanor's casket, draped with a spray of white roses and baby's breath, resting elegantly in the back of her beloved Mustang, felt absolutely right. "It's perfect," whispered Aunt Margaret, Eleanor's sister who had driven down from Toledo the night before. "She would absolutely love this." The church service was scheduled for 10 o'clock, which gave them just enough time to form the procession and make the short drive to St. Mary's. Sarah took her position behind the wheel, with Father Martinez in the passenger seat and Jake riding in Tommy's pickup truck directly behind them. Starting the procession felt like crossing a threshold into uncharted territory. Sarah had been to dozens of funerals, but she'd never been responsible for leading one, especially not in a vintage sports car carrying her mother's remains. The weight of responsibility was almost overwhelming. But as they pulled out of the funeral home parking lot, something magical happened. The Mustang seemed to transform from a machine into something more, a chariot fit for a queen, a time machine carrying Eleanor Miller back to the golden age of American automotive glory, a red-hot rebellion against the conventional wisdom that funerals had to be somber and colorless. The short drive to St. Mary's took them down Main Street, through the heart of Cedar Falls. Sarah was amazed to see people stopping on the sidewalks to watch them pass, not with the hushed reverence typical of funeral processions, but with smiles and waves and obvious appreciation for the beautiful car and its unusual cargo. "Your mother is causing quite a stir," Father Martinez observed, waving back at a group of teenagers who had stopped their bicycles to stare at the procession. "She always did," Sarah replied, feeling tears prick her eyes. She said that if people were going to look anyway, she might as well give them something worth seeing. The church was fuller than Sarah had expected for a weekday morning service. Eleanor's friends from her book club were there, along with neighbors, former co-workers, and what seemed like half the staff from the high school where Sarah taught. Word had spread about the unusual funeral arrangements, and people had come as much to witness this extraordinary farewell as to pay their respects. Father Martinez's eulogy was everything Eleanor would have wanted, full of laughter as well as tears, stories that celebrated her life rather than mourning her death. He spoke about a woman who had faced every challenge with grace and humor, who had raised 2 children to be independent and caring, who had never stopped believing that tomorrow could be better than today. Eleanor Miller was a woman who understood that life is not about playing it safe, the priest said, his voice carrying clearly through the packed church. She bought a red sports car when women weren't supposed to buy their own cars. She learned to change her own oil when mechanics told her it was too complicated for a lady. She taught her children that the worst thing you could do was live your life according to other people's expectations. Sarah sat in the front pew between Jake and Aunt Margaret, surrounded by the community that had embraced her mother's unconventional spirit. Looking around the church, she realized that Eleanor's final gift was bringing all these people together, not just to mourn, but to celebrate a life well lived. When the service ended, the congregation filed out to witness something none of them had ever seen before, a funeral procession led by a 1966 Ford Mustang convertible. Sarah could hear the murmur of conversations, the click of camera phones, and the general sense of amazement that this extraordinary farewell was actually happening. As they prepared to leave for the cemetery, an unexpected moment of panic struck Sarah. What if the engine wouldn't start? What if all their careful work had been undone by some mechanical gremlin? What if they had to transfer Eleanor's casket to a traditional hearse while dozens of people watched? But Jake seemed to sense her anxiety. He appeared at the driver's side window and squeezed her shoulder reassuringly. "She's going to start, Sarah. And even if she doesn't, we'll figure it out." That's what family does. Sarah turned the key, and the Mustang fired immediately, settling into the same smooth idle they'd heard all morning. Father Martinez climbed into the passenger seat with a smile that seemed to light up his entire face, and they took their place at the head of a procession that stretched for 3 blocks. Cedar Falls Cemetery was a peaceful place, established in 1887 when the town was just a farming community. Mature oak and maple trees provided shade for weathered headstones, and a small creek ran along the eastern border, its gentle babbling providing a natural soundtrack for quiet reflection. Eleanor's gravesite was in the newer section, not far from where her husband David rested beneath a simple granite marker. Sarah had chosen a spot under a young maple tree that would provide shade in summer and brilliant color in autumn, the kind of natural beauty her mother had always appreciated. The graveside service was smaller and more intimate than the church ceremony. Close family and friends gathered in a semicircle around the casket, which still rested on its platform in the back of the Mustang. Father Martinez spoke about resurrection and eternal life, about the hope that death was not an ending, but a transformation, about the love that connects us even when physical presence is gone. But the most remarkable thing happened after the formal service concluded. Instead of the usual awkward silence that follows most graveside ceremonies, people began approaching the Mustang, not to offer condolences, but to share memories of Eleanor and her famous red car. Mrs. Patterson from next door remembered Eleanor giving her teenage daughter driving lessons in the Mustang 20 years ago. She said every woman should know how to handle a powerful car, Mrs. Patterson recalled with a smile. My daughter still credits Eleanor with teaching her confidence behind the wheel. Bill Cooper, from the hardware store, told the story of Eleanor letting him borrow the car for his senior prom when his own vehicle broke down. She didn't even know me that well, he said, shaking his head in amazement. But she tossed me the keys and said, just bring her back with a full tank and a smile. Story after story emerged of Eleanor's generosity, her willingness to share her joy with others, her belief that life was meant to be lived fully and shared generously. Sarah realized that her mother's car had been more than just transportation. It had been a tool for building community, for creating connections, for spreading a little bit of joy in a world that often seemed short on happiness. She let me drive it once, said Maria Santos, one of Sarah's former students who was now a nurse at the regional hospital. I was going through a terrible breakup, feeling like my world was ending. Mrs. Miller found me crying in the parking lot after work and said I needed some wind therapy. We drove out to the lake with the radio turned up loud, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I might actually be okay. Jake looked at Sarah across the roof of the car, and she could see the amazement in his eyes. Neither of them had fully understood how many lives their mother had touched through her simple act of sharing what brought her happiness. Father Martinez approached them as the crowd began to thin. In 30 years of conducting funerals, I've never seen anything quite like this, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Your mother's final gift was bringing people together to celebrate life instead of just mourning death. The actual burial was private, just Sarah, Jake, Father Martinez, and Aunt Margaret remaining as Eleanor's casket was carefully transferred from the Mustang to the mechanical lift that would lower it into the earth beside her husband. Sarah placed a single red rose on the casket, followed by Jake, who added a small wrench, a symbol of the work they had done to honor their mother's memory. Rest in peace, Mom, Sarah whispered. We kept our promise. As they prepared to leave the cemetery, Father Martinez made an unexpected request. I hope this isn't inappropriate, he said, but would you mind if we took the scenic route back to town? I've never ridden in a convertible, and it's such a beautiful day. I feel like Eleanor would approve of extending this adventure just a little longer. Sarah looked at Jake, who grinned and nodded enthusiastically. Why not? They had nowhere urgent to be, and the afternoon was indeed perfect for a drive. Sarah put the top down for the first time all day, and they set off through the winding country roads that surrounded Cedar Falls. Father Martinez proved to be an enthusiastic passenger, laughing with genuine delight as the autumn wind ruffled his silver hair and commenting on landmarks he'd only seen from behind the windows of his sensible Honda Civic. I can see why Eleanor loved this, he called over the wind as they crested a hill that offered a panoramic view of the Ohio countryside. It's like flying without leaving the ground. It makes you feel alive. They drove for nearly an hour, taking the long way through rolling farmland where cornfields stretched to the horizon and red barns dotted the landscape like anchors in a sea of gold. It was exactly the kind of drive Eleanor had loved, the kind that reminded you why you lived in small-town Ohio, despite all the reasons you might want to leave. When they finally returned to town, Father Martinez asked to be dropped off at the church rather than returning to the funeral home. As he gathered his things from the back seat, he turned to face the siblings with an expression of profound gratitude. Thank you, he said simply. for letting me be part of this, for showing me that sometimes the most sacred thing we can do is celebrate life exactly as the person we're honoring would have wanted. I'll never forget this day. After dropping off the priest, Sarah and Jake drove home in comfortable silence, both lost in their own thoughts about the day, the week, and what came next. The Mustang had performed flawlessly, not a single mechanical problem, not even a hiccup. Tommy's work had been perfect, and their mother had gotten the farewell she'd dreamed of. Back at the house on Maple Street, they sat on the front porch as the sun began to set, sharing a bottle of wine their mother had been saving for a special occasion. The Mustang sat in the driveway, no longer just a restored car, but a symbol of something larger, the power of love to overcome seemingly impossible obstacles, the importance of keeping promises even when they seem crazy, and the way that sometimes the most meaningful gifts are the ones that cost us everything we have to give. "So, what happens now?" Jake asked, echoing the question that had been hanging between them all day. "With the car, I mean. With us." Sarah looked at the Mustang, its red paint glowing in the light from the street lamp. "We keep it running," she said firmly, "like you said yesterday. We take it to car shows, we drive it to the lake, we let other people make memories in it, like Mom did. And us? Do we go back to not talking for 3 years? Sarah shook her head decisively. "No, we're family. We're all the family each other has left. Mom wouldn't want us to waste that." Jake smiled, the same easy grin that had gotten him out of trouble countless times during their childhood. "Good, because I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about moving back to Ohio. Maybe it's time I stopped running from home." "You'd really consider that?" "More than consider it. I've got enough saved to put a down payment on that old garage on 2nd Street. You know, the one where Mr. Peterson used to fix cars. It's been empty for 2 years, but the owner might be willing to make a deal." Jake's voice carried a note of excitement that Sarah hadn't heard since they were kids. "I could open that restoration shop I've been dreaming about, specialize in classic American muscle cars." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "Mom would love that. She always said you had magic hands when it came to engines. And someone needs to keep the Mustang running. Can't have it sitting in the garage for another 15 years. They sat in comfortable silence as full darkness settled over Cedar Falls, watching the stars appear in the clear October sky. The town was settling into its evening rhythm, porch lights coming on, televisions flickering behind curtained windows, the distant sound of children being called in for the night. "You know what I keep thinking about?" Sarah said after a while. "What?" "That day when we were kids, maybe 8 and 11, and Mom let us help her wash the car. We got more soap on ourselves than on the Mustang, and she just laughed and turned the hose on all of us." Sarah smiled at the memory. "Dad came home from work and found the 3 of us soaked and laughing, and instead of being mad about the mess, he grabbed the camera and took pictures." Jake nodded. "I remember. And afterward, Mom took us for ice cream, even though we were still wet. She said that was the rule. Whenever you worked hard on something you loved, you had to celebrate with ice cream." "Maybe we should follow that rule," Sarah suggested. "I think there's still some Rocky Road in the freezer. Mom's favorite flavor." Of course it was. She said life was too short for vanilla. As they headed inside, Sarah took one last look at the Mustang sitting peacefully in the driveway. Tomorrow, life would return to something resembling normal. She would go back to teaching, Jake would start making phone calls about buying the garage, and they would both begin the long process of learning how to live without their mother's presence. But tonight they had kept their promise. Eleanor Miller had gotten her final ride in style, surrounded by love and laughter, carried in the car that had brought her so much joy throughout her life. The restoration was complete, not just of the machine, but of the family bonds that had been broken by grief and pride and the simple passage of time. In the kitchen, they found the Rocky Road ice cream, and ate it straight from the container, standing at the counter like they had as children after successful adventures. Outside, the 1966 Ford Mustang convertible waited patiently for its next journey, no longer just Eleanor Miller's car, but a bridge between past and future, between loss and hope, between two siblings who had rediscovered that some things, family, love, promises made to the people who matter most, are worth any amount of effort to preserve. The Chapter 4. The Final Journey. Saturday morning dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of brilliant autumn sky that made the trees look like they were on fire. Sarah woke before her alarm, her stomach churning with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. Today was the day they would find out if their impossible project had been worth the effort, the money, and the emotional investment of the past 4 days. She found Jake already in the kitchen, dressed in his only suit, a black one he'd bought for their father's funeral 8 years ago. He was drinking coffee and staring out the window at the Mustang, which sat in the driveway like a red jewel against the grey concrete. "You ready for this?" he asked without turning around. "No," Sarah admitted, adjusting the collar of her black dress. "But I don't think ready is the point." Tommy arrived at 7:30 with the platform he'd promised, a beautifully crafted piece of work covered in black velvet that would allow Eleanor's casket to rest securely across the Mustang's seats. He and Jake installed it with practiced efficiency, while Sarah handled the endless phone calls that seemed to multiply as the morning progressed. The funeral home confirming pickup times, the cemetery checking on the procession route, relatives asking for directions. At 9 o'clock, Father Martinez arrived as promised, wearing khakis and a polo shirt that made him look younger and somehow more human than his usual clerical attire. He brought with him a small leather bag containing the items he would need for the graveside service. "How are you both holding up?" he asked, embracing Sarah and shaking Jake's hand. "We're managing," Sarah replied, though the truth was she felt like she was barely keeping it together. The reality of what they were about to do, using a hastily restored classic car as a hearse for her mother's funeral, suddenly seemed overwhelming in its complexity and potential for disaster. Father Martinez seemed to sense her anxiety. "Sarah, your mother once told me that she'd rather fail spectacularly while attempting something meaningful than succeed quietly at something safe. I think today honors that philosophy perfectly." At 10 o'clock, they drove the Mustang to Henderson Funeral Home, drawing stares and whispers from the small crowd that had gathered outside. Sarah had called ahead to explain the unusual arrangements, but she could see the concern on Mr. Henderson's face as he watched them park the vintage convertible next to his traditional black hearses. "Miss Miller," he said, approaching with the careful diplomacy of someone who had dealt with countless family requests over the years, "the car is certainly distinctive. Are you confident it will handle the journey to the cemetery?" "It will," Jake said with more certainty than Sarah felt. "We've tested every system." The funeral home staff worked with surprising efficiency to transfer Eleanor's casket to the Mustang, securing it to Tommy's platform with straps that were hidden beneath the black velvet covering. Sarah watched the process with a strange sense of disconnect, as if she were observing someone else's life rather than living her own. But when they were finished, the effect was unexpectedly dignified. The casket, draped with a spray of white roses, rested naturally in the car as if it belonged there. Eleanor Miller was going to make her final journey exactly as she had wanted, in style, with the top down and the world able to see. The service at St. Mary's was everything Eleanor would have wanted, full of laughter as well as tears, stories that celebrated her life rather than mourning her death. Father Martinez spoke beautifully about a woman who had faced every challenge with grace and humor, who had raised 2 children to be independent and caring, who had never stopped believing that tomorrow could be better than today. Sarah sat in the front pew between Jake and her Aunt Margaret, Eleanor's sister who had driven down from Toledo. The church was fuller than she had expected. Neighbors, former co-workers, members of Eleanor's book club, students Sarah had taught whose lives had been touched by her mother's kindness. It was a testament to the quiet impact one person could have on a community. When the service ended, the congregation filed out to witness something none of them had ever seen before, a funeral procession led by a 1966 Ford Mustang convertible. Sarah could hear the murmur of conversations, the click of camera phones, the general sense of amazement that this unusual farewell was actually happening. Jake started the engine, and the familiar rumble filled the air with mechanical music. Father Martinez climbed into the passenger seat with a smile that transformed his normally serious face, and Sarah took her place behind the wheel, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the polished steering wheel. The procession formed behind them, a line of cars carrying family, friends, and mourners who had come to pay their respects. Tommy had volunteered to lead them in his pickup truck, his hazard lights flashing as he cleared a path through the light Saturday morning traffic. As they pulled away from the church, Sarah felt a moment of pure panic. What if the car broke down? What if they had mechanical problems in the middle of Main Street? What if this whole elaborate gesture turned into a humiliating disaster? But the Mustang purred like a contented cat, its rebuilt engine running with the smooth precision of a Swiss watch. The car handled the stop-and-go pace of the funeral procession with ease, and Sarah began to relax for the first time in days. "Your mother would be laughing right now," Father Martinez said, as they turned onto Oak Street, the tree-lined avenue that led to Cedar Falls Cemetery. "She always said that if people were going to stare, she might as well give them something worth looking at." Sarah found herself smiling despite her tears. She used to take Jake and me for drives in this car when we were kids, windows down, music loud, not caring what anyone thought. "And now she's taking her final drive the same way," the priest observed. "There's something perfect about that." The cemetery was a peaceful place, established in 1887 when Cedar Falls was just a farming community. Mature oak and maple trees provided shade for the weathered headstones, and a small creek ran along the eastern border, its gentle babbling providing a natural soundtrack for quiet reflection. Eleanor's gravesite was in the newer section, not far from where her husband David rested, beneath a simple granite marker. Sarah had chosen a spot under a young maple tree that would provide shade in summer and brilliant color in autumn, the kind of natural beauty her mother had always appreciated. The graveside service was smaller and more intimate than the church ceremony. Close family and friends gathered in a semicircle around the casket, which still rested on its platform in the back of the Mustang. Father Martinez spoke about resurrection and eternal life, about the hope that death was not an ending, but a transformation, about the love that connects us even when physical presence is gone. When the formal service concluded, something unexpected happened. People began approaching the Mustang, not to offer condolences, but to share memories of Eleanor and her famous red car. Mrs. Patterson from next door remembered Eleanor giving her teenage daughter driving lessons in the Mustang. Bill Cooper from the hardware store recalled Eleanor letting him borrow the car for his senior prom when his own vehicle broke down. Story after story emerged of Eleanor's generosity, her willingness to share her joy with others. "She let me drive it once," said Maria Santos, one of Sarah's former students who was now a nurse at the local hospital. "I was going through a bad breakup, and Mrs. Miller said I needed some wind therapy. We drove out to the lake with the radio turned up loud, and for an hour I felt like I could conquer the world." Jake looked at Sarah over the roof of the car, and she could see the amazement in his eyes. Neither of them had realized how many lives their mother had touched through her simple act of sharing what brought her happiness. As the crowd began to disperse, Father Martinez approached them with an expression of genuine emotion. "In 30 years of conducting funerals, I've never seen anything quite like this," he said. Your mother's final gift was bringing people together to celebrate life instead of just mourning death. The burial itself was private, just Sarah, Jake, and Father Martinez remaining as Eleanor's casket was lowered into the earth beside her husband. Sarah placed a single red rose on the casket, followed by Jake, who added a small wrench, a symbol of the work they had done to honor their mother's memory. "Rest in peace, Mom," Sarah whispered. "We kept our promise." As they prepared to leave the cemetery, Father Martinez made an unexpected request. "Would you mind if we took the long way back to town? I've never ridden in a convertible, and it's such a beautiful day." Sarah looked at Jake, who grinned and nodded. Why not? They had nowhere urgent to be, and the afternoon was indeed perfect for a drive. Sarah put the top down, and they set off through the winding roads that surrounded Cedar Falls, the autumn countryside spread out around them like a painting. Father Martinez proved to be an enthusiastic passenger, laughing with delight as the wind ruffled his silver hair and commenting on landmarks he'd only seen from behind the windows of his sensible Honda. "I can see why Eleanor loved this," he called over the wind. "It's like flying without leaving the ground." They drove for an hour, taking the scenic route through the countryside, where cornfields stretched to the horizon and red barns dotted the landscape like anchors in a sea of gold. It was exactly the kind of drive Eleanor had loved, the kind that made you remember why you lived in small-town Ohio despite all the reasons you might want to leave. When they finally returned to town, Father Martinez asked to be dropped off at the church rather than the funeral home. As he gathered his things from the back seat, he turned to face the siblings with an expression of profound gratitude. "Thank you," he said simply, "for letting me be part of this, for showing me that sometimes the most sacred thing we can do is celebrate life exactly as the person we're honoring would have wanted." After dropping off the priest, Sarah and Jake drove home in comfortable silence, both lost in their own thoughts about the day, the week, and what came next. The Mustang sat in the driveway as the sun began to set, no longer just a restored car, but a symbol of something larger. The power of love to overcome seemingly impossible obstacles, the importance of keeping promises even when they seem crazy, and the way that sometimes the most meaningful gifts are the ones that cost us everything we have to give. That evening, as they sat on the front porch, sharing a bottle of wine their mother had been saving for a special occasion, Jake brought up the question that had been hanging between them all day. "So what happens now?" he asked. "With the car, I mean. With us." Sarah looked at the Mustang, its red paint glowing in the light from the street lamp. "We keep it running," she said. "Like you said. We take it to car shows, we drive it to the lake, we let other people make memories in it like Mom did. And us? Do we go back to not talking for 3 years? Sarah shook her head. "No, we're family. We're all the family each other has left. Mom wouldn't want us to waste that." Jake smiled, the same easy grin that had gotten him out of trouble countless times during their childhood. "Good. Because I was thinking of moving back to Ohio, maybe opening that shop I've been dreaming about. In Cedar Falls. Why not? It's home, and someone needs to keep that Mustang running." As the night deepened around them, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years, a sense of completeness, of family restored and promises kept. The past week had been the hardest of her life, but it had also been transformative in ways she was only beginning to understand. The 1966 Ford Mustang convertible sat in the driveway, no longer just Eleanor Miller's car, but a bridge between past and future, between loss and hope, between two siblings who had found their way back to each other through the simple act of keeping a promise to the woman who had taught them that impossible was just another word for something you hadn't tried hard enough to achieve. In the distance, a train whistle echoed across the sleeping town, carrying its cargo toward destinations unknown. But Sarah and Jake were exactly where they belonged, in the place their mother had always called home, surrounded by the memories and dreams that make up a life well lived. The restoration was complete, not just of the car, but of something far more important. The promise had been kept, the final journey taken, and Eleanor Miller had gone out exactly as she had lived, in style, surrounded by love, and leaving behind something beautiful for those she cared about most. And in the morning, when the sun rose over Cedar Falls, the red Mustang would still be there waiting for its next adventure, carrying within its restored heart the love of a family, the skill of craftsmen, and the enduring truth that some things are too precious to let rust away in a garage, no matter how much work it takes to bring them back to life. The end. Thanks for watching. Some cars come back to life, others bring someone back with them. See you in the next story, right here on Rust and Memory.